It was past midnight at Jodrell Bank in England, and Bernard Lovell's team was tracking two signals from the moon at the same time. One was American, one was Soviet. The American one belonged to a spacecraft called Eagle, with two men inside who had walked on the moon and were trying to sleep before their journey home. The Soviet one had been silent for 4 days. On July 21, 1969, at 15:47 Greenwich time, it began to move. It was descending toward the lunar surface, and then, 4 minutes later, it stopped. What Bernard Lovell had just heard was the end of the Soviet Union's last attempt to win the space race. A robotic spacecraft called Luna 15 had crashed into the side of a lunar mountain 554 kilometers from where Neil Armstrong's boots had left their marks in the dust. 2 hours and 4 minutes later, the Eagle lifted off. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin came home. They had won. They had no idea they had been racing. This is the story that ran alongside the most watched television event in human history without a single camera pointed at it. A secret program, a last card played from a losing hand, and the most striking fact of the entire space race. The moment when America won the moon race and didn't know, until years later, that it had beaten anyone to it. It was July of 1969. The Cold War had run for 24 years. The space race, which had been its most visible theater, the contest that produced Sputnik and Gagarin and Glenn and a dozen other names the world still carries, had cost both nations more than money. It had cost them their finest engineers and their bravest people. It had cost them sleep and margin, and on 3 occasions it had cost them lives. And now it was almost over. But the Soviets still had one card left to play. On the night of July 3, 1969, 13 days before Apollo 11 departed Cape Kennedy, the Soviet N-1 moon rocket had ignited on its launch pad at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. 30 engines, 12 million pounds of thrust. It rose 30 meters above the pad before it lost control and fell back. The explosion destroyed the launch complex entirely. It would take 18 months to rebuild. The Soviet cosmonaut program, the program that was going to put Alexei Leonov, the first man to walk in space, onto the lunar surface, was finished. Leonov had trained for years. He had stood on the pad. Now he stood down. Sergei Korolev, the man who had built the Soviet space program from nothing in the decade after the war, had died on an operating table in Moscow 3.5 years earlier. The man who replaced him was capable. He was not Korolev. The program had been running on Korolev's momentum, and the momentum was failing. The N-1 had exploded in February. It had exploded again in July. The cosmonauts who might have walked on the moon would never get there. There would be no Soviet astronaut on the moon, but there might still be Soviet soil from the moon. If a robot could do what men could not, the story of who won the race would be more complicated. The headlines would be harder to write. Luna 15 had left Earth on July 13th, 3 days before Apollo 11. While the Americans were still counting down at Cape Kennedy, the Soviets already had their spacecraft in lunar orbit. Luna 15's mission, known to almost nobody outside the Soviet space program, was to land on the moon, collect a sample of lunar rock, and return it to Earth before the Apollo astronauts could return with theirs. Not the moon itself. Just the first sample. Just the headline. The Soviets told no one, not the press, not their own people. When NASA's mission control grew concerned about potential radio interference and asked Soviet officials about the probe, they were told it was an orbiter, a science mission, no plan to land. It was Frank Borman, commander of Apollo 8, the first men to orbit the moon, who made the call. He had met Soviet space official Mstislav Keldysh in person some years before. He called him directly. Keldysh sent a telegram with enough orbital details to assure NASA the two spacecraft would not interfere, but said nothing about the landing plan. The deception held. Neil Armstrong's crew was told about Luna 15's existence while traveling to the moon. They were told it was an orbiter. They flew past it, landed below it, and walked on the surface without knowing what was circling above their heads. For 4 days, Luna 15 made loop after loop around the moon. The original Soviet plan had been to land within 2 hours of Apollo 11, to hit the surface, collect the sample, and leave before the Americans could even unfurl their flag. But the terrain below the intended landing site looked rougher than the charts had suggested. The Soviet controllers delayed, then delayed again. Every delay was a gamble. Wait too long, and the race was already over. Move too soon, and risk crashing into a boulder field. July 20th arrived. Apollo 11 landed. Neil Armstrong's boot made contact with the Sea of Tranquility at 2017 hours Greenwich time. 600 million people, roughly 1 in 5 human beings alive on Earth, watched it happen on their televisions. In Moscow, state television covered the landing briefly and late. Pravda ran the story on an inside page. Soviet officials said carefully that the Americans' achievement was significant, but that the Soviet Union had always believed automated missions were the more scientific approach. They said nothing about the spacecraft still circling above the moon. They said nothing about the sample canister waiting to be filled. Above the Sea of Tranquility, Luna 15 completed its 40th orbit, then its 50th. In the lunar module Eagle, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were trying to sleep. The moonwalk had lasted 2 hours and 31 minutes. They had collected 47.5 pounds of lunar rock and soil. They had planted the flag, taken the call from President Nixon, and photographed a place no human eye had ever seen from the ground. Now they were resting before the ascent engine firing that would take them home. Below them, the ancient gray dust held the only human footprints in the history of the universe. Above them, somewhere in the dark, a Soviet robot was making its 52nd orbit. Neither man knew about the second part. Sirius. At 15:47 Greenwich time on July 21st, 1969, the Soviet controllers in Moscow gave the order. Luna 15 fired its descent engine. The probe had made 52 orbits. It had waited 4 days longer than planned. It was running out of time. At Jodrell Bank in England, Bernard Lovell's team was listening. Jodrell Bank was the largest steerable radio telescope in the world, and throughout the Apollo 11 mission, it had been tracking both spacecraft simultaneously, the American and the Soviet, with the same equipment. Lovell's team had been monitoring Luna 15's signal for days without knowing what the probe intended to do. When the signal began to change, when the Doppler shift indicated that the probe was no longer maintaining orbit but was accelerating toward the surface, the room went quiet. They were listening to a landing attempt that had not been announced from a probe whose mission had been officially described as orbital research. 4 minutes into the descent, the signal stopped. Luna 15 had hit the side of a mountain in the Sea of Crises. Its descent angle had been slightly off. There was no warning, no time to correct. The signal was there, and then it was not. Somewhere in the gray vacuum, 554 kilometers from Tranquility Base, a piece of Soviet engineering had become rubble. One of the British technicians spoke quietly into the recording. "I say," he said, "this has really been drama of the highest order." No one in the world outside that room knew yet what he meant. At 1550, Luna 15 became debris. At 17:54, 2 hours and 4 minutes later, Eagle's ascent engine fired and Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin left the moon. They did not know about the crash. They knew about Luna 15 as an orbiter. They did not know about the sample mission, or the competition, or the 4 days of delays, or the Soviet engineers in Moscow who had just watched the signal go flat. The 47.5 pounds of lunar rock in Eagle's storage were now the only lunar samples anywhere in the solar system. They always had been. The race had been decided not by human effort alone, but by a mountainside in the sea of crises, and by 4 minutes of bad geometry. Armstrong brought those samples home. He gave them to the scientists. He answered questions at press conferences with characteristic precision and characteristic brevity. He never made much of what he had beaten. He rarely spoke of Luna 15. When asked, he said only that he had understood its purpose. That was the whole account. Reflective. In Moscow, the official reaction was silence, followed by careful diminishment. Mstislav Keldysh told the press that the Soviet Union was concentrating wholly on satellite systems. No one mentioned Luna 15's landing attempt. No official acknowledged that the Soviet Union had been trying to return lunar samples at the moment of the moon landing. The cover-up was clean and total. It held for 20 years. The full truth that Luna 15 had been racing Apollo 11 for a sample return at the exact moment of the landing was not officially confirmed until 1989. The audio recording made at Jodrell Bank that July night was not released to the public until 2009. 40 years after the fact, people could finally hear the room go quiet. And then the technician's voice, calm and astonished, saying what it meant. The N-1 rocket exploded twice more, in 1971 and 1972, before the program was canceled. The Soviet lunar cosmonaut program was officially terminated in 1974. No Soviet citizen ever set foot on the moon. Alexei Leonov, who had trained to be the first, lived to see 2019 before he died. He had been ready. The machine had not. The space race had lasted 12 years, from Sputnik in October of 1957 to that July afternoon in 1969. It had cost both nations more than either government ever fully admitted. It had also given the world satellites and weather forecasting, and the first images of Earth from far enough away to see it was small and blue and alone. And it had ended in the vacuum between a crashing Soviet robot and a sleeping American astronaut who had no idea the other was there. Neil Armstrong brought his samples home and never made much of what he had beaten. That was enough. If you watched Apollo 11 on television in July of 1969 and had no idea this was happening above the moon, you were in good company. Even the men on the surface didn't know the whole story. Subscribe. There are more quiet legends still waiting to be told.